Okay, well, thank you for having me today. Good afternoon. My name is Ananda Marin. As it was shared, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Education at UCLA. And I'm joining you from Tavangar, the homelands of the Tongva people. And I'm excited to be here virtually with you all who are in Chicago, place where I grew up, and the homelands of the Three Fires people. So the talk I will be giving today is titled Deepening Understandings of Lands and Waters as a Subject in Coordinated Activity. It's grounded in my own multifaceted genealogy, including my own subjectivities as a woman of cross descent, African American, Choctaw, non-enrolled, and European American, primarily settlers from England. The research I will share is also connected to a history of projects and partnerships with Native communities and universities, including the American Indian Center of Chicago, Northwestern University, the Menominee Language and Culture Commission, and the University of Washington. At a high level, these projects explored learning about, with, and from the natural world as a human activity that was part of development. So these research projects have engaged in theory building activities that center Indigenous ways of knowing and the everyday science practices of Indigenous families. At the same time, findings from these studies can speak to the kinds of sense-making that occurs across cultural communities. These projects were framed by the understanding that central to science education are constructions of nature and relationships between humans and nature. Over the last decade, my colleagues and I have argued that the constellations of human sense-making practices, activities, values, beliefs, and artifacts, or culture, are connected with the natural world. Nature-culture relations, then, is a term that encompasses the diversity of ways in which our cultural worlds are connected with and mutually constituted by relations with the natural world. From an interactional perspective, one way that nature-culture relations is enacted is through personal mobilities like walking and direct participation with the natural world. In addition, nature-culture relations are impacted by power and historicity, shape social organization and decision-making, and influence cognition, learning, and development. Building with the work of Indigenous scholars like Gregor Kahete, Oscar Coagli, and Robin Kimmerer, I view science as repertoires of knowledge systematically created to describe and explain the ways of the world. These repertoires culturally vary and can mutually inform one another. In this talk, I discuss learning as a process of remaking nature-culture relations, the organization of attention and observation. The research that I share examines how cognitive processes like attention are culturally variable and intertwined with science activities like observation and the practices that support such activities, including question asking, constructing explanations, and finding evidence. This research is grounded in the premise that attention and observation are central to questions of epistemology or ways of knowing and equity. Just as algebra is seen as a gateway course in math, attention habits also serve as gateways to participation because of their importance in establishing and maintaining social interactions. The work I'm going to share today is guided by a set of questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to. So the first question asks, when we account for lands and waters, including the ground beneath our feet, the weather world, and our plant and animal kin, in analyses of interaction, how do our theories of learning expand? And the second question asks, if our theories of learning expand in consequential ways, then what responsibility do we have as researchers to cooperatively design learning environments to honor these teachings? These are a set of questions that guide my own professional vision. So drawing on Chuck Goodwin's classic work in this area, you might think of these as a set of questions that help me as a researcher to reflect on what I'm trying to see and what I highlight in code. Why do I foreground these questions? Because through my history of relationships, I've come to know lands and waters as subjects that actively structure our context for teaching and learning. I see lands and waters as both the content of learning and the context for our learning processes. In other words, our relationships with land and water shape participation frameworks or how people organize themselves in relation to one another in place, and thus the moment-to-moment of unfolding interaction. So in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to briefly discuss research on attention and observation. Then I will describe a series of forest walk studies that took up questions of attention and observation. I'll provide an overview of walking, reading, and storing land, which is a finding from the work that I've been engaged in, and pose a set of emerging research questions, share some data, and then leave time for discussion. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time thinking about cultural variation and learning by attending. Ethnographic research provides evidence for cultural variation in attention. For example, researchers have found cultural variation in how attention is directed to the field or an object, as well as the kinds of relationships that people attend to. There are also differential patterns in interactional styles by cultural community. So in an attention following style, for an example, the adult acts in accordance with the attentional cues of the child and does not require the child to switch focus to a new object or event. In contrast with attention directing styles, an adult manages the child's attention by directing them to an object or event not previously attended to. In comparison to American families, for instance, first generation Mexican American families tend to favor attention directing styles. And under experimental conditions, young children learn more vocabulary when an attention directing style is promoted. Some communities privilege selective or focused attention, while others tend to simultaneously organize attention, noticing third-party activities. In many classrooms, however, focused attention is emphasized. So children are expected to inhibit their behaviors, control their bodies and emotions, and seek permission from the teacher who is the authority in the room. This form of organizing attention and observation is found in communities that have experiences with schooling that follow assembly line models of instruction. It is less common among indigenous heritage families in Mexico and Guatemala with minimal levels of Western forms of schooling. As Barbara Rogoff and colleagues have found, in these families, learning involves wide keen attention in anticipation of or during contribution to the endeavor at hand. Leadership is flexible and communication is based on coordination among participants. Coya Chavez, Rogoff, and Mejia Aruz also argue that attention research has been biased towards focused attention versus unfocused attention, an indication of researchers' own backgrounds of middle-class European practices and folk knowledges. It's important to ask whether the ability to selectively attend is a developmental goal across all communities and cultures. Taken together, this larger corpus of research suggests that how variations in attention are read by caregivers and teachers may have significant consequences for learning, and more specifically for learning science, participating in science activities, and engaging in science practices. So how are attention and observation linked? Across contexts, young children and adults organize attention to participate in science-related activities like observation. Observation as a between person and between place activity depends upon the coordination of attention, including making one's orientations to the environment, social actions, and particular phenomena observable to others. So Kidwell and Zimmerman, building off the work of Goffman and Sachs, termed this the organization of observability. The organization of observability lays the groundwork for participating in observational investigations. This is likely true whether people are learning in built environments like school classrooms or outdoor environments like nature preserves. Moreover, people's actions, including their talk, gestures, and whole body movements, support the organization of observability. So before moving on, I just want to synthesize what's been described so far. And there are 5 points I want to highlight. The first is that nature-culture relations are central to both learning about the natural world and science education. The second is that one way to conceptualize learning is as a process of remaking nature-culture relations through the organization of attention and observation. The third is that attentional and observational practices are culturally variable. Fourth, that through the coordination of attention, particular phenomena are made observable to others. And fifth, that the organization of observability lays the groundwork for participation and observational investigations in the science practices that support those investigations. Working from these understandings, I posit that one way to move toward equity, justice, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism in science education is to take seriously the epistemological and ontological practices of Indigenous families, and more specifically, nature-culture relations as a pedagogical beginning. For me, this requires designing research activities to better understand heterogeneity in attention and observation. And for instance, I knew that if I wanted to better understand the diversity of attentional and observational practices that Indigenous and families engage in the natural world, then I needed to go outside of the psychology laboratory and the classroom. So this understanding has led to the design of a study series on family forest walks. Why take this approach? There is a breadth of work in the fields of situated, distributed, and embodied learning that taken together gives us reason to believe that social, material, technological, and ecological contexts matter, and that how we use our bodies to interact in those contexts matter for cognition and learning. Walking, I would argue, is a human activity that supports the development of relations with people, places, and more than humans, as well as capacities and identities. Forest walks are an everyday familial practice where children are apprenticed into ways of knowing. In addition, family forest walks are an observational practice common among Indigenous families that foreground between persons and between place interactions. Thus, family forest walks provide researchers with opportunities to learn about interactions among young children and their caregivers while they are on the move in outdoor settings. The study series of family forest walks that I'll talk about today included caregivers and children between the ages of 4 to 8 years old. We also conducted a similar study with parents and kids between the ages of 10 to 12 years old, but I won't be sharing data from that study series today. Study series 1, which is with the younger children, consisted of multiple family walks. And while on walks, the focal parent and focal child use wearable cameras to capture their interactions. And families were also given digital cameras to take pictures. So one of the findings from the analysis of the family forest walks is what my colleague and I, Megan Bang, have talked about as walking, reading, and storing land. So walking, reading, and storing land is a methodology for learning about the natural world that has been embedded within Indigenous ways of knowing for generations and continues to shape lived human nature relations. In addition, this is a methodology which has evolved over socio-historic time and varies in importance and influence across cultural communities. Walking, reading, and storing land can be described as a developmental process that is dynamic and that occurs within the biological and physical world between people and more than human kinds, phylogenetic, ontogenetic, and microgenetic levels. Walking, reading, and storing land is comprised of at least 3 dimensions: coordinating attention and observing, generating explanations, and finding evidence. The dimensions of walking, reading, and storing land are situated within particular contexts and locations. The work of walking, reading, and storing land is distributed across people, more than humans, place, and time. The explanations or stories that are formulated are specific to particular ecosystems and landscapes. In addition, the activity of walking, reading, and storing land is structured by sedimented resources, including material tools that have been passed down across generations, like compasses, field guides, and trail markers, artifacts created by more than humans, such as deer trails and dens, and discursive tools or ways of asking questions, storying, and conversing. Walking land involves body sense and is guided by the experiences of our feet and thus our bodies meeting and being in motion with the ground over time. Reading land is facilitated by embodied and performative actions designed to foreground the perceptual environment in relation to domain knowledge. It also involves mutually attending to and intently observing life forms across time and space. And these processes are supported by micro resources such as directives and gestures. Storing land is the co-narration of observations. So typically micro stories are narrated. These micro stories are usually no more than 4 to 5 sentences in length and report ongoing observations of phenomena and or hypotheses around possible future observations. To illustrate walking, reading, and storing land, I will share 3 video examples from a forest walk with son Andrew and mom Tanya. Andrew and Tanya went on 5 walks at the time. And at the time of the walks, Andrew was about 5 years old. The family has some experience with forest walks. However, they had little prior experience with the particular location they visited for the forest walk study. I will share video and transcripts from the family's first walk, which took place in July, and their second walk, which took place in August. I selected the set of video clips to both illustrate walking, reading, and storing land, and to share an evolving line of analysis that is not yet complete. So this new line of analysis is informed by my professional vision and asks a series of sub-questions about the organization of attention and observation as fundamental to social interaction. Been working with a graduate student at UCLA, Kyle Hallie Irby, to wonder about the following set of questions. In the context of forest walks, what do ethical relations between mother and son look like? How is this family organizing attention in order to make more than human kin visible to one another? And in what ways do we see, if at all, more than human kin as subjects rather than objects in the participation frameworks that mom and son create? To get us situated, I provided an aerial view of the forest preserve that Andrew and Tanya were walking in. And you can see a gravel access road. Well, I can see it because I am familiar with it. It might be hard for you all to see, but it's right next to that orange line with the arrows, right? There's a large gravel access road that stretches across the forest reserve. And then next to that gravel access road is a pond. It's circled in red. And to get to that road and the pond, mom and son had to walk through the forest canopy, which is represented by the red line. Okay, so this is a clip from the family's first walk. And you'll see Andrew and Tanya as they come upon a body of water that was highlighted in that aerial map. It's important to note that the son's video is on the left and the mom's video is on the right. So you remember I said that the families used wearable cameras, and as a part of my own analysis, I synced those videos. So the child's video is always on the left, parents on the right. I made that decision informed by Eleanor Oakes' work and what she talks about, right, as the right-left bias in the West, and right as being indicative of the onset of action. So I guess I'll also say that for some folks that don't watch video that's synced in this way, it can be a little, it can be a lot. You know, I'm kind of used to it. And so it might be helpful if you want to just concentrate on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. And actually, I mixed up what Eleanor Oakes had written. We talked about left as being the inception of access, or the inception of action. Okay, so I'm going to play the video. I just want to, can you all hear that? Okay. Let me just turn it up a little bit.
Look at the pond, Tom. We might see something really cool in here. Mom. What? Somebody pinch you. Why? Why do I need to pinch you? This is a great moment. You might see a fish under there. I might see a turtle. Mom, I know a perfect place for spotting. You see the reflection. Come on, Mom.
There's something moving in there.
Well, tell me what.
Oh, maybe you have a better view there.
Okay. And I'm going to go through the transcript and then I'll go back to the video so we can watch it again. So this particular clip starts with the mom saying, look at the pond, we might see something really cool in here. And what I want to emphasize is that at this point they're walking together. The child is in front, and because of that walking formation, they have a shared gaze, right? So they don't, how do I want to say this? They have a shared gaze of the horizon, not necessarily shared eye gaze amongst themselves. And the mom is using a directive look to help coordinate attention and to organize observation of the pond. And then the son says, Mom, and he turns his body and pauses. And I would argue that this physical movement and his use of the phrase mom, right, acts as an exclamation that complements the talk that comes after that. So the mom says what, and the son says, somebody pinch me, right? So I think that he's expressing excitement and wonder. And at this point, they move to almost a side-by-side formation. And the mom pinches him and says, "Why do you want me to pinch you?" And the son says, "This is a great moment." And at that point, when he says, "This is a great moment," they've begun walking again, and they have that shared gaze towards the pond. And then the mom says, "Let's see, come here," as they're starting to walk over to the pond. And the son says, "We might see fish over there." And the mom says, "We might see a turtle." She also is, I think, inviting him to become quieter. She says, "Shh." And again, they have a shared gaze of the pond. They're walking along. The son is in front, the mom is in back. And together they're making suggestions about what they see. And then the son says, "Mom, I know a perfect place for spotting." You see the reflection. And so he's at this point announcing this plan that he has to find this, to go to this perfect place for spotting. And at that point, he again turns his body and he says, "Come on, Mom." And I think he is attempting to draw his mom into his plan, right, to get to this perfect place. And the mom is pointing him, in fact, to something else, that there's something moving in there. And the son says, "Tell me what's in there." But then the mom switches gears and says, "Or maybe you have a better view over there," indicating the perfect place that he's found. And they return to a tandem formation where the son is in front, and they decide that they're going to see what is over there at the perfect place. So I'm just going to play this again with some of that highlighting.
Look at the pond, Mom. We might see something really cool in it. Mom. Somebody pinch you.
Why? Why do you want me to pinch you?
This is a great moment. You might see a fish under there.
I might see a turtle.
Mom, I know a perfect place for spotting. You see the reflection. Come on, Mom.
There's something moving in there.
Well, tell me what.
Oh, maybe you have a better view there.
Okay. So we just saw the clip where he, identifies that this is a great moment and he's found a perfect place for spotting. And then a few minutes later, he comes upon something in the water that he thinks is Loch Ness Monster. It's hard to see from this picture, but if you look at what's circled in orange, there is probably a large tree branch, and the way it's in the water and the way that it's coming out of the water, I think I would even, like if I was in that imaginative space, consider it to be Loch Ness Monster. And so here's that clip.
Mom, look. See that cave over there?
What do you see?
See that cave that I'm pointing to?
Yeah.
The Loch Ness Monster might be in there.
Do you think so?
Uh-huh.
Wow. Remember how you spotted that frog? Oh, did you hear something?
Yeah, that might be the Loch Ness Monster.
I think it's a frog. Maybe a bullfrog?
Mom, something's coming out of the water. When the water shakes.
Let's take a picture of it, because remember I thought it dried up, so I'm taking a picture so I remember.
Me
It's
too.
over that hill.
Yeah,
And you're right. When the water moves, there's something in it, right?
right. Mom,
Might be something if there was fish in there.
no.
Something is making a noise. You think it's a duck?
No, Bigfoot. I mean, Loch Ness Monster.
That's a little pet.
Okay, so in this clip, they continue to talk about Loch Ness Monster, and you might have noticed that he said no Bigfoot, and then I mean Loch Ness Monster. What's important to know about that is that as they're walking through the forest canopy, he has a conversation with his mom about Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, when he's asking her basically, are Bigfoot and Loch Ness real? And how do you know if they're real? Right? So this is a question that he continues to come back around to. They have that conversation under the forest canopy, and it's when they get to the water that he begins this investigation of Loch Ness. So this next clip is from their second walk. So they're in the same location that we saw in the first two clips. And in this clip, Andrew's asking questions about Loch Ness Monster, and the mom is directing Andrew's attention to a frog.
Mom, guess what? I took a picture of Loch Ness Monster. See him? He's real.
There's that frog.
Mom, he's real.
Let's listen. See if we can.
Monster. Mom, I found Loch Ness Monster. I found him for real. So now I know if he's fake.
That was a frog.
Yeah.
He jumped in and scared him. You scared me. Hey, look at. There you see.
Oh,
See?
oh, but I'm glad I...
Can you see him? He's by the water. There's like a...
No.
He's got like a little platform. Isn't that cool?
Mom, see it? See the Loch Ness Monster's tail?
I do.
Wow, he's pretty long.
He is long.
Mom, look.
Sorry,
I'm
Bob,
so
I didn't scare you.
I'm glad I see it.
Okay. So in this clip, I would argue that mom and son are tuning to the sonic and the visual elements of lands and waters, right? And in this particular instance, observation and the work of observability is about more than looking, which I think is important, especially when we read some of the work on observation and science education that focuses so much on looking. In addition, mom and son are moving in and out of orienting to their individual experiences in place and mutually orienting. I think this ebb and flow of attunement is important. So for the majority of the time, they're in an ecological huddle and they're forming participation frameworks that do the work of verbally, orally, and physically reorganizing themselves in relations to lands and waters. And this includes a level of responsivity or acknowledging the sounds that other than humans are making and wondering about their presence and ongoing activity. I also find the ebb and flow interesting with regard to the ethical relations between mom and son. So in a way, they're engaging in meaning making at the same site, but their activity, while coordinated, is also individual. So if we take a look at the transcript, and the text that's highlighted blue, we can see the son saying, he's real, mom, mom, he's real. And he's referring to Loch Ness Monster. And the mom is saying, just listen to the sound, right? So she doesn't necessarily take up his bid there. She's inviting him to listen to the sound of the frogs, and there are also cicadas that year, right? So you can hear like the cicadas and the dragonflies. And then if you look at the text that's highlighted in green, they move more to this mutual observation of Loch Ness, where the son's saying, mommy, I found Loch Ness Monster. And the mom says, you did. He says, I found him for real. And she says, awesome. And then she goes back to the frog. She says, that was a frog. And the son says, yeah. And the mom says, that the son scared the frog and to again look at the frog. But then we go back to this kind of movement between individual and collective, where if we look at the text that's highlighted in red, the mom is saying, can you see him? She's talking about the frog. and mentioning that they scared the frog and, referencing that seeing the frog is cool, but the son doesn't really respond to that, at least verbally, right? And returns to Loch Ness Monster and says, Mom, see it, see the Loch Ness Monster's tail. And she says, I do. And the son says, it's pretty long. But then the mom returns to the frog again, saying, sorry, we didn't mean to scare you. And the son says, I'm glad I see it, not indicating he's glad he sees the frog, but he's glad that he sees Loch Ness Monster. So for me and for the graduate student that I'm working with, Kyle Hallie Irby, this kind of interaction has been really interesting. And it's something that we see throughout the forest walks with this particular mom and son. And it's what's motivated our question about what do ethical relations look like in this context? And what is the mom doing and what is the son doing? The other thing that we're thinking about, right, is this idea of more than human kin as subjects. So if we were to look at this interaction and consider Loch Ness and frog as subjects, then I wonder about the possibilities for thinking about polyvocality of the conversation, right, that's going on. And how are mom and son in this complex and ecological perceptual field coordinating their participation in relation to more than human actors, and in particular the sounds that more than human actors are making, but also the movements that they think that more than human actors are making. And so for us, when we think about these two questions together, right? Like, how are more than humans being recognized? How are more than humans helping to structure the activity that's going on? And what is the ebb and flow of the mom and son's conversation? We're trying to think through the teachings and lessons that mom and son are co-constructing about the relational and the interdependent processes of attention and observation. So to put this in a form of a question, you might ask, or I might ask, if I believe that I'm visiting Frog's place and that Frog can sense my presence and hear me, then what are my responsibilities with regard to observability and observation? You could also ask the same question about Loch Ness, right? Like, if I believe that I'm visiting Loch Ness's place and that Loch Ness can sense my presence and hear me, then what are my responsibilities with regard to observability and observation? I think there's also real questions here epistemologically about what is real. How do we know what is real? How do we find out if something is real? And throughout these conversations, the mom uses, I think, tentative language with her son, saying you might, you could, maybe. She never says to him that Loch Ness isn't real. She never says to him that Bigfoot isn't real. And this reminds me a lot actually of Gregor Cajete's work. He's a Tewa scholar, a Pueblo scholar, who talks about the importance of legends and myths for imagination and creativity in young children's learning. And our ability to be able to operate in those spaces of legends and myths, and to be able to operate in spaces when in fact we may not know if something is real. So I want to go on to just make some summary statements or arguments, and offer some possibilities for elementary science work. So the first is that within families, walking the land facilitates learning about the natural world. And I would argue that as educators, we might consider ways that we can plan for familial based outdoor activities. And not only outdoor activities, but outdoor activities that include repeated visits to the same place over time, which is different in some regards from current kind of field trip models that we might have. Second, I think it's fair to say that the role of lands and waters in sense making is active and animated in parents and children's meaning making in ways that have probably been underestimated. So in teaching and learning environments, I think this means that we must learn to better hear and see the knowledge that families are sharing. And to take what families are sharing seriously. And then in the process of assembling questions, directives, and shifts in movement, I would argue that opportunities for supporting and or creating science-related practices arise. And for me, this means rethinking how we assemble questions and directives in embodied ways in classroom spaces, whether they're in schools or community-based centers or outdoors. You know, in the paper that I shared with the journal club, I write about the use of questions. And one of the things that I found, at least in this corpus of data, is that children take on the work of asking questions, and their questions are often leading the activities. And they also engage in a form of question asking that I would argue may not always be common in schools. And so one example, for instance, is, and this is an example that's in the Walking, Reading, and Storing Land paper, is that the son that's featured in that paper will ask his mom a series of questions to get information to answer a question that she may have posed. So if the mom asks the son a question and he doesn't know the answer, he never says, I don't know. He asks a question to get information to formulate an answer, and he'll ask her like a series of questions, in fact, to get the answer. And it's that freedom and question making that allows them to engage in cooperative meaning making. And I think there are little things like that that are really important that we could attend to as researchers and educators. The other thing I'd like to turn us to is that I would argue that this corpus of work also demonstrates that young children and their parents weave together multiple forms of questions, directives, and shifts in movement for the purposes of making entities, phenomena, beliefs, and thought processes visible, right? And it's the coordination of attention by highlighting what is available for observation in the perceptual field and what might be available for observation on the horizon that supports making those entities, phenomena, and beliefs available. The other thing I would say is that it's, again, the use of questions and directives that are, in this case, always embodied, that establish oneself as a leader or knower and capable of making meaningful contributions. So young children in these contexts are creating an ecology for collaborative learning that's supporting science-related identities, and they're using questions and directives in embodied ways to establish themselves as knowers. And so for me, this is related to some of the comments that I made at the beginning of the talk, right, around the coordination of attention. And I think it raises questions about the importance of the freedom of bodily movement for the coordination of attention. And how is it that the architecture of space organizes attention if we're thinking about indoor built environments, or if we're outdoors, what is it about the affordances of landscapes and waterscapes that support the organization of attention? Okay, and then what is really clear for me when I look at the corpus of forest walk videos is that marking and remembering places of importance shapes possibilities for future joint inquiries. So I shared video clips from the family's first walk and the family's second walk. In total, they went on 5 walks together from early summer to mid-fall. And across those walks, they marked and remembered places, right? And those were often marking places, again, through the use of embodied movements and directives and questions. But for instance, in the first walk, they come across the pond, they have a conversation about Loch Ness, and they have a conversation about remembering those places. And then they return to that place for future joint inquiries, right? And so it's that process of marking and remembering places that serves as guideposts for the content of their inquiries. and the routes that they take across time. And then I also want to point to this engagement and imaginative perspective taking to hypothesize about the lives of more than humans and relations with humans, right? So this happens in the work of telling micro stories or small stories. And again, these micro stories are like no more than 4 to 5 sentences in length, and they report ongoing observations of phenomena and hypotheses around possible future observations. A lot of times this is an imaginative process that is in relation to more than humans, right? So in this particular, the clips that we looked at together today, the son is imagining Loch Ness Monster as a living entity that is in the water, and he's engaging in questions about whether or not Loch Ness will be in the same place. And forest walks with other families, families are raising questions, for instance, about I don't know, they have a whole series of questions, but you know, there's one forest walk where families are raising questions about the presence of deer and thinking about deer trails, and what is it that the deer are doing there, and how can they find deer, and all of these wonderings are coordinated through verbal channels, obviously, but they're also deeply tied to specific locations and specific markers in place, which I think is really important. So for me, there's kind of 3 important takeaways when I think about teaching and learning environments. One is that directives and questions can be used to develop, support, and sustain epistemic navigation and openness. The second one has to do with the productive nature of small disagreements. And this, I think, is more highlighted in the readings that I shared for today. I wouldn't argue that the mom and son and the examples that I showed are disagreeing, but I do want to return to the ebb and flow of the individual versus the mutual orientation and what that means for activity. And for me, right, like considering that takes me to questions about the organization of classroom spaces, because I think more often than not, teachers do a lot of work to engage in a mutual line of inquiry, right? And we see less of this ebb and flow, although I think Chris Gutierrez has written about this when she writes about third spaces, but those aren't necessarily designed spaces. So then the question becomes, how do we improvise or have a flexible enough approach so that we can be in that ebb and flow of activity? And then the third is that walking and whole body movements are a resource for learning about and with the natural world. You know, and I would argue that walking can provide content for learning, and it can also be a process for learning. That in fact, in movement, while people are walking, they're doing a lot of important work to synthesize what they have observed when they've stopped at particular locales to engage in in-depth observation. And then perhaps more importantly, with the questions that I raised for today, I would suggest that across time, this family is creating a collection of stories so far where they, along with more than human kin, are the subjects. And that one way we know that relationships with lands and waters from a context for teaching and, sorry, let me start that again. So across time, across their walk, they're asking questions about who lives here, how long have they lived here, do they, meaning frogs, dragonflies, Loch Ness, notice us? Does our presence affect them? How can we remember this moment in time, and what are we observing now? And as they're asking and answering these questions, they're also creating a collection, if we think about the work of Doreen Massey, as of stories so far, right? So they're engaging in a process of placemaking where they, along with more than human kin, are subjects. And the question for me becomes, what participation frameworks do these families create to make more than human kin observable to one another? And how do they address more than human kin? And how do we see more than human kin in the organization of their participation frameworks themselves? So one of the things I'm thinking through, drawing on Laura Harjo's work, who's an Indigenous geographer, is how to conceptualize these moments as kin space-time envelopes. So again, because the families have gone on multiple walks, how do the microgeographies of place, so when they're under the forest canopy, when they're by the pond, when they're on the gravel trail, matter? And if we think about Doreen Massey's work in this idea of stories so far, how do the stories themselves match up to those particular locales? So I think it's important that the conversation about Loch Ness primarily occurs when they're by the pond, and that conversations of Bigfoot primarily occur when they're under the forest canopy. And while they're under the forest canopy, for instance, they might say, remember we saw the frogs, let's go visit the frogs again. But their conversation about frogs, for the most part, happens when they're there with the frogs. And for me, this begets important questions about the relationship between place and learning, and place not just as a container for content, but place and the dynamic changes of lands and waters themselves as being integral to the processes of learning. So I'm going to stop there. Just say thank you, Yakoke.